The town laughed when a homeless Navy SEAL moved into a cave, until his dog became their only hope after 8 feet of snow. They mocked a homeless Navy SEAL's cave. His dog saved them after 8 feet of snow. As a brutal Wyoming winter closed in, Ethan Cole had nothing left but a retired military German Shepherd named Shadow and a forgotten cave high above Silver Creek. The town called him crazy. Then a historic blizzard buried the valley, cut off every road, and trapped families beneath walls of snow. What happened next would turn a homeless veteran and his loyal dog into local legends. Comment 1 if you trust a loyal dog with your life, or 0 if you think people deserve a second chance, and tell us where you're watching from. The first snow of the season had not yet fallen on Silver Creek, Wyoming, but winter was already waiting in the mountains. It sat on the distant peaks like a silent army, watching. The sky above the Wind River Range was pale and cold, streaked with long bands of gray cloud that drifted slowly across the horizon. Golden aspens trembled in the autumn wind. Dry grass bent along the roadside. The smell of approaching frost lingered in the air. A battered pickup truck rolled into town just after noon. The engine rattled. The paint was faded. One headlight was cracked. Everything about the vehicle suggested it had traveled farther than it should have. Behind the wheel sat Ethan Cole. At 59 years old, he still carried the broad shoulders of a Navy SEAL, though age and hardship had carved deep lines into his face. His dark hair had long since turned silver around the temples. A weathered brown jacket hung loosely from his frame. His eyes looked older than the rest of him. They were the eyes of a man who had spent years carrying things he could never put down. Beside him sat a German Shepherd. The dog was large, powerful, and remarkably calm. His muzzle had begun turning gray. A faded military working dog harness rested across his back. His name was Shadow. For nearly a decade, he had served alongside Ethan in Afghanistan. Together they had searched villages, detected explosives, and survived more nights than either should have. Now they were both retired, both scarred, both trying to find a place to belong. Silver Creek wasn't supposed to be their final destination. It was simply the last place left. Ethan slowed near the center of town. The streets were quiet. A few pickup trucks lined the curb. An old diner sat beside the highway. A feed store stood across from a gas station. Everything looked exactly the way small mountain towns always looked. Simple, familiar, safe. Or at least it appeared that way. Shadow lifted his head and looked out the window. His ears twitched. The dog seemed to sense tension before Ethan did. He usually did. Ethan pulled into the parking lot of a trailer rental office located beside a storage yard. The building was small and square, with faded white paint peeling from the walls. A sign out front advertised monthly rentals. This was the place. The last possibility. Ethan shut off the truck. For several seconds, he simply sat there. His hand rested on the steering wheel. The silence inside the cab felt unusually heavy, because if this didn't work, he had nowhere else to go. The bank had taken his ranch 3 weeks earlier. The property had been in his family for decades. His father had worked that land, his grandfather before him. But years of medical bills, PTSD treatment, counseling costs, and missed payments had finally caught up with him. The ranch was gone. The house was gone. Everything except the truck and the dog. Shadow nudged Ethan's arm gently. The familiar gesture pulled him back to the present. Ethan managed a faint smile. "Yeah, buddy," he said quietly. "Let's see if we still got a little luck left." They stepped out into the cold afternoon. Inside the office, a middle-aged woman sat behind a desk reviewing paperwork. She looked up and smiled politely. For a moment, hope flickered. Then the office door opened behind Ethan. A tall man entered wearing an expensive coat and polished boots. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. The woman immediately straightened. "Ethan Cole," the man said. His voice carried no warmth. Ethan turned. He recognized him instantly. Harold Briggs, owner of the largest ranching company in the county. One of the wealthiest men in Silver Creek. Harold smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind that never reached the eyes. "I heard you were coming," Ethan's stomach tightened. Didn't know I needed permission. Harold chuckled. No, but folks around here talk. The woman behind the desk suddenly looked uncomfortable. Harold rested both hands on the counter. You should know that trailer's already spoken for. The woman hesitated, then quietly nodded. I'm sorry. Ethan stared at her. The hesitation told him everything. The trailer had been available a moment ago. Not now. Not after Harold arrived. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Shadow stood silently beside Ethan's leg, watching, waiting. Ethan had spent enough years around powerful men to recognize exactly what was happening. Harold wasn't forcing him out with threats. He was doing something worse, making sure no one helped him. The same result. Cleaner hands. Harold leaned slightly closer. You've had a rough stretch. Ethan said nothing. But Silver Creek's a small town. Harold's smile widened. People like stability. There it was, the polite version. Not welcome, not here, not among us. Ethan looked around the office one last time, then nodded. Understood. He turned and walked out. Shadow followed immediately. The dog never looked back. Outside, the wind had grown stronger. Leaves tumbled across the parking lot. The mountains beyond town appeared darker now, more distant. As Ethan climbed into the truck, he caught his reflection in the side mirror. For a moment, he barely recognized the man staring back. Former Navy SEAL, combat veteran, business owner, husband, landowner, now homeless. Funny how fast life could erase titles. The truck rolled slowly through town. He passed the diner, the hardware store, the church. Everywhere he looked, people seemed rooted, connected, part of something. He felt like a ghost moving through someone else's life. By late afternoon, he parked near a scenic overlook above the valley. Silver Creek stretched below, small and peaceful beneath the autumn sky. Shadow jumped out and began exploring the hillside. Ethan remained beside the truck. The wind carried the scent of pine and cold stone. For a long time, he simply stared at the mountains, thinking, trying not to think. A dangerous balance. Pete's D had taught him that idle moments often became battlefields. Memories slipped through cracks, the wrong sound, the wrong smell, the wrong silence, and suddenly Afghanistan returned. He heard rotor blades, gunfire, radio chatter, screams. Then another memory surfaced, far worse. Rachel, his wife, the hospital road buried beneath snow. Emergency crews delayed, the storm, the waiting, the helplessness, the terrible phone call. Ethan closed his eyes. Not now. Please not now. His breathing quickened, his chest tightened. The familiar panic began creeping upward. Then he felt a wet nose against his hand. Shadow. The dog pressed gently against him, grounding him, anchoring him, exactly as he had done hundreds of times before. Ethan exhaled slowly. The panic eased. Not gone, never gone, but manageable. Good boy. Shadow stayed beside him, watching, protecting, always protecting. As the sun began sinking behind the mountains, Ethan noticed something unusual farther up the slope. A dark opening cut into the side of a rocky ridge. At first, it looked like a shadow. Then he realized it wasn't. It was a cave, large, natural, hidden among the pines. Curiosity stirred. He grabbed a flashlight from the truck and started hiking. Shadow immediately moved ahead. The climb took nearly 20 minutes. Loose rock shifted beneath their boots. Wind whispered through the trees. The higher they climbed, the farther Silver Creek seemed below. When they finally reached the opening, Ethan stopped. The cave mouth stood nearly 12 feet high. Weathered stone framed the entrance. Cold air drifted outward. The interior disappeared into darkness. Shadow stepped inside first. His paws clicked softly against stone. Ethan followed. The beam of his flashlight swept across rough walls. The chamber extended much farther than he expected. Dry, solid, protected. Most importantly, out of the wind. He stood quietly, listening. The cave felt strange, not threatening, not welcoming, simply waiting. Like a place forgotten. The kind of place people overlooked. The kind of place nobody wanted. Which meant it might be exactly what he needed. An hour later, as twilight settled over the valley, Ethan drove back into town and bought supplies with what little money remained. A lantern, canned food, blankets, Rope, water containers, nothing more, nothing less. Word spread quickly. Small towns always noticed unusual things. By the time Ethan made his second trip up the mountain, people were already watching. A pair of teenagers laughed openly near the gas station. An older ranch hand shook his head. Someone shouted from across the road, "Hey, caveman!" Several others laughed. Ethan kept walking, load after load, trip after trip, ignoring them. The sun disappeared. The temperature dropped sharply. Lights flickered on across Silver Creek. Warm homes glowed in the darkness below. Meanwhile, a homeless veteran and his aging dog carried their lives into a cave. Near the diner window, Harold Briggs watched from inside, coffee cup in hand, expression unreadable. The townspeople laughed. They shook their heads. They whispered. Some felt pity. Most felt disbelief. Nobody thought the cave would last. Not through a Wyoming winter. Not through the storms that always came. High above them, Ethan finished unloading the final supplies. Night had fallen completely. The valley lights twinkled below like distant stars. Shadow sat beside him at the cave entrance, silent, alert, faithful. Ethan looked out across the mountains. The cold wind brushed his face. Winter was coming, and for the first time in his life, he would face it with no house, no land, no family, only a dog and a cave. Far below, Silver Creek settled into sleep. High above the town, Ethan Cole stared into the darkness and wondered a question that nobody else believed had an answer. Could a man and his dog survive a Wyoming winter inside a cave? The wind whispered across the mountainside. Below him, the lights of Silver Creek glowed softly in the valley like scattered stars. Families gathered around dinner tables. Wood stoves crackled. Televisions flickered behind curtains. Life continued. Normal, warm, safe. Ethan sat on a folded blanket near the cave entrance and watched it all from a distance. He felt farther away from those lights than the miles between them. Shadow lay beside him with his head resting on his paws. The old German shepherd appeared relaxed, but Ethan knew better. Even after retirement, the dog never fully stopped working. One ear remained slightly raised. Always listening, always alert, always protecting. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset. Cold air drifted down from the mountains. Ethan stood and carried a lantern deeper into the cave. The beam revealed rough stone walls disappearing into darkness. The cave was larger than he had realized during daylight. Several chambers branched away from the main tunnel, some narrow, some surprisingly wide. The floor remained dry. That alone felt like a blessing. He chose a relatively flat area, about 50 feet from the entrance, and began organizing supplies. A sleeping bag, 2 blankets, several cans of food, a water container, a small camp stove. It wasn't much, but it was enough for tonight. Shadow followed him silently. When Ethan finally sat down against the wall, exhaustion settled into his bones. Not physical exhaustion, something deeper. The kind that came from carrying disappointment for too many years. Outside, darkness swallowed the mountains. Inside, the lantern cast long shadows across the stone. For a while, everything felt peaceful. Then the memories arrived. They always did. Sometimes they waited days. Sometimes only minutes. Tonight they came quickly. Ethan closed his eyes, and Afghanistan returned. A village surrounded by dust. A radio crackling in his ear. The weight of body armor, the smell of diesel fuel, the distant sound of helicopters. Then came the explosion. The memory struck without warning. A flash, a blast wave, chaos. Voices shouting, someone screaming for a medic. Ethan's chest tightened instantly. His breathing changed. The cave vanished. The mountain vanished. His mind dragged him backward through time. Back to the desert, back to war, back to all the men he couldn't save. His hands trembled. He knew what was happening. He never asked permission. It simply arrived, like weather, like winter, like grief. The sound of claws scraping stone broke through the memory. Ethan opened his eyes. Shadow stood directly in front of him. The dog pressed his nose against Ethan's chest, grounding him, pulling him back. Ethan took a slow breath, then another. The panic slowly loosened its grip. "Good boy," he whispered. Shadow remained beside him until his breathing steadied. Only then did the dog return to his blanket. The cave became quiet again. But sleep did not come easily. Hours passed. The lantern burned lower. The darkness deepened. At some point, Ethan drifted into an uneasy sleep. That was when Rachel appeared. Not as she had been at the end. As she had been before, laughing. Standing in a field of wildflowers near their ranch, sunlight in her hair, life in her eyes. For a moment the dream felt real, painfully real. Then the scene changed. Snow, wind, darkness, the emergency call. The blocked road, the storm, the helpless waiting. Rachel lying in a hospital bed. Machines, silence. Ethan woke suddenly, his heart pounded. Cold sweat covered his skin. For several seconds he couldn't remember where he was. The cave walls slowly emerged from darkness. Shadow was already awake, watching him. The dog quietly walked over and rested beside him. No barking, no excitement, just presence. That was enough, it always had been. Ethan stared toward the cave ceiling. "Sorry, Rachel," he whispered into the darkness. The words escaped before he could stop them. He had spoken them thousands of times over the years, sometimes aloud, mostly inside his own head. "Sorry I wasn't faster. Sorry I wasn't better. Sorry I couldn't save you." The guilt never left. It simply changed shape. Outside, wind moved through the pines. Inside, a retired Navy SEAL sat alone with a ghost. Morning arrived slowly. A pale gray light spread across the cave entrance. The mountains emerged from darkness one ridge at a time. Shadow was already awake. The dog stretched and walked outside. Ethan followed. The cold air hit his face, sharp, clean. For the first time since arriving, he truly saw the view. The entire valley stretched below. Silver Creek sat nestled among rolling hills and ranchland. Beyond it rose endless mountains, wild, beautiful, unforgiving. The cave entrance overlooked everything. Ethan stood quietly. Maybe this place wasn't home, but it was shelter, and right now, shelter mattered. The next several days settled into a routine. Each morning, Ethan climbed down to town for supplies. Each afternoon, he carried something back up the mountain. Firewood, buckets, tools, food. Every trip earned more attention, more stares, more whispers. Silver Creek had become fascinated by its newest outsider. One afternoon, Ethan entered the diner for coffee. The room felt quiet, not completely, just enough to notice. Several men glanced his way. A waitress offered a polite smile. Near the window, Harold Briggs sat with two ranch owners. Their conversation stopped briefly, then resumed. Ethan knew that silence. Veterans learned to recognize it. People discussing you before you entered. People deciding who you were, without asking, without knowing. He ordered coffee and sat alone. At a nearby table, a teenager laughed. "How's cave life treating you?" Several others chuckled. Ethan simply sipped his coffee. The teenager seemed disappointed by the lack of reaction. That happened often. People expected anger, defensiveness, embarrassment. Instead, they got silence. The truth was, Ethan no longer had enough energy to argue with strangers. Life had already exhausted him. After leaving the diner, he bought several additional blankets and began the long climb back to the cave. Snow clouds gathered over the mountains. Winter felt closer now. Shadow trotted ahead as usual. Halfway up the trail, the dog suddenly stopped. His ears lifted, his body became still. Ethan noticed immediately. Military dogs rarely reacted without reason. "What is it?" Shadow stared toward the cave, then started moving again, faster this time. Ethan followed. When they reached the entrance, the dog didn't settle down. Instead, he disappeared deeper inside, past the sleeping area, past the storage supplies, farther into the darkness. Ethan frowned. That was unusual. Shadow normally stayed close, especially in unfamiliar places. The dog vanished around a bend. Several moments later, Ethan heard something. Scratch, scratch, scratch. He grabbed the lantern, followed the sound. The cave narrowed into a twisting corridor. The air felt cooler here, the shadows deeper. Eventually, he found Shadow standing beside a stone wall. The dog scratched at the rock, then looked back at Ethan. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Ethan walked closer. The wall appeared ordinary, dark stone. Rough surface, nothing unusual. Find something? Shadow scratched again, then sat waiting. Ethan examined the area with his lantern. Nothing. No opening, no tunnel, no obvious reason for the behavior. After several minutes, he gave up. "Come on." Shadow hesitated, then reluctantly followed. That night, the dog returned to the same place, again and again, each time scratching the wall, each time staring at Ethan afterward, as though trying to communicate something. The behavior continued for days. Every evening, every morning, always the same section of cave, always the same wall. At first, Ethan assumed it was instinct. Perhaps a scent trapped in the rock, a small animal hidden somewhere inside. But gradually doubt began to grow. Shadow was not an ordinary dog. Years of military service had taught Ethan something important. When Shadow became obsessed with something, there was usually a reason. A very good reason. One evening, after another trip to town, Ethan sat near the cave entrance, watching sunset paint the mountains gold. Shadow lay beside him. The dog seemed calm. For the moment, below them, Silver Creek prepared for another cold night. Smoke rose from chimneys. Cars moved through town. Life continued, but Ethan couldn't shake a feeling. Something was changing, not outside. Inside the cave, inside the mountain, inside Shadow's mind. The dog suddenly stood. Without hesitation, he turned and disappeared back into the darkness, toward the same corridor, toward the same stone wall. Ethan watched him go. For a long moment he remained seated. Then he picked up the lantern. Something about Shadow's persistence unsettled him. The dog was trying to show him something. Of that much he was certain. He simply didn't know what, yet. Deep inside the mountain, hidden beyond darkness and stone, a secret waited. And Shadow had already found it. The old German shepherd disappeared into the narrow corridor without hesitation. His claws clicked softly against the stone floor. Ethan followed several steps behind, carrying the lantern high enough to throw light across the rough cave walls. The farther they traveled, the quieter the mountain became. The sounds from outside vanished completely. No wind, no birds, no distant vehicles from town. Only silence, the kind of silence that seemed ancient, the kind that made a person feel small. Shadow stopped at the familiar wall, the same place, the same section of dark rock he had visited every day for nearly a week. The dog immediately began scratching. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Then he turned and looked directly at Ethan, waiting. Ethan crouched beside the wall. This time he examined it more carefully. His fingers moved across the stone. Rough surface, cold texture, nothing unusual. At first, then he noticed something. A faint current brushed against his skin. He froze, very slight, almost impossible to feel. But it was there, air moving air. His eyes narrowed, he leaned closer. The lantern revealed a thin crack running through the stone, no wider than a pencil, easy to miss. Yet when Ethan held his hand near it, he felt the current again. A steady breath flowing through the mountain. Well, I'll be damned. Shadow's ears lifted immediately. The dog seemed almost pleased, as though he had finally convinced Ethan to pay attention. Ethan carefully pressed his face closer to the crack. Warm air touched his cheek, not hot, not cold. Warm, his pulse quickened. Outside temperatures had been dropping every night. Yet somehow this hidden fissure carried air warmer than the cave itself. That made no sense. Unless, the thought lingered. He spent the next hour investigating. Using a folding shovel and pry bar from his supplies, Ethan carefully removed loose rock around the fissure. The work was slow. The stone resisted every effort. But eventually a small section broke away. The opening widened. A rush of air immediately flowed through. Steadier now, more noticeable, and unmistakably warm. Shadow stepped forward and sniffed the opening. His tail moved once. The first sign of excitement Ethan had seen from him in days. Beyond the crack lay darkness, a different chamber hidden behind the wall. Ethan widened the opening enough to squeeze through. The lantern beam swept forward. His breath caught. The hidden chamber stretched much farther than expected. Natural stone columns rose from the floor. The ceiling curved overhead like the inside of a cathedral. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. Most surprising of all, the temperature felt noticeably different. Warmer, much warmer. Ethan stepped fully inside. Shadow followed immediately. The dog moved confidently through the darkness, as though he already knew this place. The deeper Ethan traveled, the stronger the warm airflow became. Eventually, he found its source. At the far end of the chamber, several deep fractures split the rock floor. Warm air drifted upward through them continuously, steady, constant. The mountain itself seemed to be breathing. Ethan stood motionless. His SEAL training had taught him many things: survival, engineering, adaptation, pattern recognition. He didn't know much about geology, but he understood one important fact. Stable heat meant survival, especially in winter, especially in Wyoming, especially for a man living inside a cave. For several long moments he simply stared. Then he slowly smiled, the first genuine smile in months, maybe longer. Back in Silver Creek, people saw a homeless veteran sleeping in a hole in the mountain. They saw failure, misfortune, desperation. But standing here now, Ethan saw something completely different: possibility. Over the following days, curiosity replaced despair. Every spare hour became an investigation. Shadow accompanied him everywhere. The dog often located things before Ethan did: a hidden passage, an unusual draft, a narrow opening behind a cluster of rocks. Again and again, Shadow's instincts proved correct. One afternoon, they discovered something even more remarkable: a rusted metal grate partially buried beneath debris. Ethan cleared away dirt and stone. The grate covered a vertical shaft extending upward through the mountain. Cold air flowed downward. Warm air rose below, a natural ventilation system. His mind immediately started working. Airflow, heat circulation, temperature control. The cave wasn't just a shelter, it was a system, a naturally occurring system. And systems could be improved. That evening, Ethan sat near the cave entrance, studying rough sketches he had drawn on a notebook. Shadow rested beside him. The valley below glowed beneath another cold sunset. For the first time since losing the ranch, Ethan wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what he had found. The shift surprised him. Hope felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous. Hope had disappointed him before, yet it remained impossible to ignore. The next morning, he climbed into town for supplies. At the hardware store, he purchased rope, nails, a handsaw, and several inexpensive tools. The cashier raised an eyebrow. "Building a mansion up there?" A few customers laughed. Ethan smiled politely. Something like that. The laughter followed him out the door. At the diner, later that afternoon, the jokes became louder. The nickname had already spread. The Cave Soldier. People seemed to enjoy it. A group of ranch hands sat near the front window. One of them called out as Ethan passed, "How's the underground palace coming along?" Several others laughed. Ethan kept walking. Years ago, the comments might have bothered him. Not anymore. Because they didn't know what he knew. They hadn't felt the warm air moving through the mountain. They hadn't seen the hidden chamber. They hadn't watched Shadow uncover one secret after another. Let them laugh. For now. By early November, Ethan's daily routine had completely changed. Each morning began with exploration. Each afternoon focused on construction. He widened passages, cleared debris, mapped airflow routes, measured temperatures. The work gave him purpose, something PSD often stole. Purpose. Days passed faster now. The nightmares still came. Rachel still appeared in dreams. The guilt remained, but the cave demanded attention. And attention left less room for old ghosts. One evening, while carrying supplies deeper into the hidden chamber, Ethan noticed something unusual. The warm airflow remained constant regardless of outside temperature. Day, night, cold, wind, it never changed. That realization struck him immediately. The mountain wasn't merely trapping heat. It was generating stable temperatures naturally. A geothermal chamber. The conclusion felt almost unbelievable, yet every observation supported it. Ethan sat beside the warm fissure and stared into the darkness. The realization settled slowly. Winter was coming. A brutal Wyoming winter. The kind that destroyed unprepared people. The kind that had taken Rachel. The kind that terrified most of Silver Creek. But deep inside this mountain existed a natural source of warmth that no storm could easily touch. Shadow rested beside him. The dog seemed content, satisfied, as if his mission had finally been accomplished. Ethan reached down and scratched behind his ears. "You found it first, didn't you?" Shadow leaned slightly into the touch. The answer seemed obvious. Without the dog, Ethan would never have discovered the chamber, never noticed the airflow, never understood the cave's true value. A strange feeling settled over him, gratitude, not simply for the discovery, for the partnership, the loyalty, the years they had survived together. Outside, snow clouds gathered along the distant peaks. Winter continued its slow march toward Silver Creek. The town remained unaware. People still laughed, still whispered, still called him the cave soldier. Meanwhile, hidden inside the mountain above them, a homeless Navy SEAL and his retired war dog had uncovered something that could change everything. Not gold, not treasure, not fortune, something far more valuable, a way to survive. And Ethan had only begun to understand what the cave was truly capable of becoming. The realization stayed with him through the night. While cold winds swept across the mountains outside, Ethan sat near the hidden geothermal chamber, with a notebook balanced on his knee. Shadow slept nearby. The warm airflow drifted steadily through the darkness. Not once did it falter. Not once did it change. The mountain was offering something rare, consistency, and consistency saved lives, especially during winter. Ethan studied the rough sketches he had drawn over the past several days. Arrows marked airflow routes. Circles identified warmer chambers. Measurements covered nearly every page. Years earlier, military instructors had taught him an important lesson. Survival wasn't about strength. It was about systems. Strong people got tired. Strong people got injured. Strong people made mistakes. Good systems continued working even when people couldn't. The cave already had the beginnings of a system. His job was to improve it. The next morning began before sunrise. Frost coated the grass around the cave entrance. The valley below looked silver beneath the first light of dawn. Ethan drank coffee from a metal cup while reviewing his plans. Then he got to work. For hours he hauled rocks. Not random rocks, specific ones. Dense stones capable of storing heat. He collected them from a nearby creek bed and carried them uphill one load at a time. The work was exhausting. His shoulders burned, his back ached, but every stone served a purpose. By midday, he had constructed the first section of a heat retention wall near the geothermal chamber. The idea was simple. Warm air would heat the stone throughout the day. The stone would slowly release that warmth throughout the night. Nothing complicated, just physics and patience. Shadow followed every step of the process. Sometimes the dog rested nearby. Other times, he wandered deeper into the cave. Whenever he found a loose section of rock or unstable footing, he seemed to pause beside it until Ethan noticed. More than once, Shadow's behavior prevented Ethan from making mistakes. The partnership felt strangely familiar, almost like deployment. Back then, they had trusted each other with their lives. Perhaps they still did. Over the next week, the cave slowly transformed. A storage area appeared near the entrance. Sleeping quarters moved deeper inside where temperatures remained more stable. Airflow channels were widened. Loose debris was cleared. Small stone barriers redirected warm currents toward occupied areas. Each improvement made a difference. Small at first, then noticeable, then remarkable. One evening, after sunset, Ethan sat near the sleeping area and checked the thermometer he had purchased in town. Outside temperature, 24 degrees. Inside temperature, 49. He stared at the numbers, then checked again. 49. The cave was winning. A faint smile crossed his face. For the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, genuine confidence began replacing uncertainty. The cave wasn't just survivable. It might actually be comfortable. The following afternoon, Ethan made another trip into town. The reactions had become predictable. People watched him, whispered, smirked. The story of the homeless veteran living inside a cave had become local entertainment. At the Silver Creek Diner, Several customers fell silent when he entered. Others openly stared. Ethan ordered coffee and sat near the back. The waitress, a kind woman named Melissa, brought his cup over. Unlike most people, she didn't seem interested in judging him. "You keeping warm up there?" she asked. "Getting there." She smiled politely. Before she could say more, laughter erupted near the front counter. A group of ranch hands sat together. One of them pointed toward Ethan, the cave soldier's back. Several others chuckled. Another man leaned back in his chair. "Tell us something." Ethan remained silent. The man continued anyway. "How's real estate working out underground?" More laughter. Even Melissa looked uncomfortable. Ethan slowly took a sip of coffee, then returned the cup to the table. "The roof never leaks." For a moment, nobody responded. Then a few surprised laughs broke out. Not mocking this time. Genuine. The ranch hands exchanged glances. Apparently, the caveman could answer back after all. Ethan finished his coffee and left. Outside, Shadow waited beside the truck. The dog rose immediately, ready to leave. Always ready. As they loaded supplies, a shadow fell across the parking lot. Ethan turned. Harold Briggs stood nearby, hands in his coat pockets, watching. The wealthy ranch owner looked toward the mountains, then toward Ethan. "Heard you've been renovating." Ethan closed the tailgate, trying to stay ahead of Winter. Harold smiled slightly. Winter always wins. The statement hung between them. Neither man looked away. Finally, Harold nodded once. "Good luck with your cave." Then he walked off. Ethan watched him disappear down the sidewalk. Something about the exchange bothered him. Not the words, the certainty behind them. Harold sounded like a man who believed nature couldn't be negotiated with. Maybe he was right. But Ethan had spent a career surviving situations other people considered impossible. Sometimes preparation changed outcomes. Back at the cave, work continued. Days passed. The first snowfall arrived. Only a few inches. Enough to whiten the mountains. Enough to remind everyone what season was coming. One afternoon, Ethan began constructing a water collection system. Snowmelt from higher elevations already trickled through several cracks in the cave. With a little effort, he redirected the flow into storage containers. Clean water, reliable water. Another problem solved. As evening approached, Shadow suddenly barked. A single sharp bark. Rare, very rare. Ethan looked up immediately. The dog stood near a narrow side passage. His ears were raised, body tense, watching. "What is it?" Shadow moved deeper into the passage, then stopped, waiting. Ethan followed. The corridor twisted through darkness before opening into a small chamber. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then Ethan noticed a section of ceiling overhead. Cracks, fresh ones. The rock appeared unstable. He stepped backward instantly. Seconds later, a small shower of stone fragments crashed onto the floor. Not enough to cause injury, but enough to reveal a serious problem. Had he continued using that passage regularly, a larger collapse might eventually have occurred. Shadow had spotted the danger first, again. Ethan knelt beside him. "You just keep saving me, don't you?" Shadow wagged his tail once. The moment passed quietly, but it stayed with Ethan. The dog wasn't merely loyal. He was invaluable. As November deepened, the cave became increasingly sophisticated. Heat storage walls expanded. Sleeping areas improved. Airflow routes became more efficient. The place no longer resembled an emergency shelter. It felt intentional, engineered, purposeful. One evening, after finishing a long day of work, Ethan climbed to a rocky overlook above the cave. Shadow accompanied him. The sun was setting. Golden light washed across the valley. Silver Creek glowed below, tiny, distant, peaceful. Smoke rose from chimneys. Cars moved through town. People carried on with ordinary lives. Few of them realized how much winter was already shaping Ethan's days. Every decision revolved around preparation. Every improvement mattered. Every hour counted. Because once the storms arrived, mistakes became expensive, sometimes fatal. The wind shifted, carrying a strange sound across the mountains. A distant bugling call. Ethan turned. Far across the valley, a herd of elk moved through the hills, dozens of them, traveling earlier than expected. He frowned slightly. Something about their behavior felt unusual. The animals seemed restless, purposeful, migrating before the true cold arrived. Shadow noticed them too. Both man and dog watched silently. Then the elk disappeared into the trees. The moment lingered, a subtle warning hidden within the landscape. Though Ethan didn't realize it yet, someone else in Wyoming had noticed the same thing. An old ranger, a man who understood mountains, a man who knew what unusual animal behavior often meant. And before long, that man would climb the mountain to deliver a warning that could change everything. The first hard frost arrived 3 days later. Silver Creek woke beneath a blanket of white crystals shimmering across rooftops, fence posts, and empty fields. Thin ice formed along creek edges. The mountains surrounding the valley looked sharper now, colder, somehow, as if winter had moved a little closer during the night. High above town, Ethan Cole stepped outside the cave, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. Shadow emerged beside him. The German shepherd paused immediately. His nose lifted toward the wind. Ethan noticed it. Over the past few weeks, he had learned to trust the dog's instincts more than his own. Shadow studied the distant tree line, silent, focused. Then he relaxed. Whatever had captured his attention was gone, for now. Ethan looked toward the valley. The cave had changed dramatically. Stone heat walls lined portions of the interior. Storage shelves held supplies. Water containers stood neatly arranged near the rear chambers. The geothermal airflow continued, moving through the hidden fissure exactly as before. The system worked, better than Ethan had hoped. Yet a strange feeling lingered. Not fear, not exactly. More like anticipation. The sense that something larger was approaching. That afternoon, while repairing a section of airflow tunnel near the cave entrance, Ethan heard an unfamiliar sound. An engine. He looked down the mountainside. An old green pickup slowly climbed the rough access trail. The vehicle looked nearly as weathered as the mountain itself. Shadow stood immediately, alert, watching. The truck finally stopped near the lower ridge. A tall, elderly man stepped out. Gray beard, heavy canvas coat, worn boots. He moved carefully but confidently across the rocky slope, like someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. The man reached the cave entrance and nodded once. "You're Ethan Cole." It wasn't a question. Ethan stood. "Depends who's asking." The old man smiled faintly. "Walter Hayes." The name sounded familiar. Ethan remembered hearing it in town. Former Forest Service ranger. 40 years in the Wyoming wilderness. Retired. Respected. Some said stubborn. Others said brilliant. Walter looked past Ethan toward the cave. "So the rumors are true." Ethan folded his arms. "Depends which rumors." The part about a Navy SEAL turning a mountain cave into a house. A slight grin appeared beneath Walter's beard. That part. Ethan shrugged, trying to stay warm. Walter glanced toward Shadow. The dog watched him closely. Good dog. Shadow didn't move. Walter seemed pleased by that. A dog that trusts everybody ain't much use in the mountains. The ranger removed his gloves and approached the cave entrance. For several minutes he said nothing. He simply observed. The airflow, the stonework, the modifications. His experienced eyes missed very little. Finally he nodded. "You've done good work." The compliment surprised Ethan. Most visitors came looking for something to laugh at. Walter seemed genuinely impressed. They spent the next hour talking. Not about politics, not about town gossip, about weather, mountains, survival. The conversation felt natural, comfortable. Both men understood difficult environments. Both respected preparation. Eventually, Walter grew quiet. His expression changed. The easy conversation disappeared. Something heavier replaced it. "You seen the elk?" Ethan nodded. "A few days ago." Early thought so too. Walter stared toward the distant mountains. "I've been watching them for weeks." The ranger's voice carried a seriousness Ethan immediately recognized. "The elk ain't the only ones." "What do you mean?" Walter pointed toward the northern ridges. "Deer moving early, then toward the forests. Birds leaving sooner than normal, then toward the creek below. Water freezing in places it shouldn't." The old ranger's eyes narrowed. "I've seen this before." The statement lingered. Ethan waited. Walter continued. The winter of '97, his voice lowered. Storm buried half this county. Ethan listened carefully. How bad? Walter looked directly at him. Bad enough people still talk about it. Silence settled between them. Wind whispered through the pines. Shadow remained unusually attentive, as if he understood the importance of the conversation. Walter finally spoke again. The mountains are warning us. Ethan frowned. You think something's coming. I know something's coming. The certainty in Walter's voice sent a chill through him. Not because the ranger sounded dramatic, because he sounded convinced, completely convinced. Walter removed a folded weather map from his coat pocket. The paper was covered with notes, temperatures, pressure readings, observations, years of experience condensed into a few markings. The pressure's dropping faster than it should. He pointed toward the western mountain range. Storm systems stacking up. Another mark. Ground freezing early. Another. Animal migration patterns are wrong. He folded the map. I've spent most of my life reading this country. The old ranger looked toward the distant peaks. And right now, it's screaming. Neither man spoke for a moment. The afternoon sunlight had already begun fading. Long shadows stretched across the mountainside. Ethan finally asked the question. How much time? Walter exhaled slowly. Maybe weeks, he shrugged. Maybe less. The answer wasn't comforting. The ranger left shortly before sunset. Before climbing into his truck, he paused beside Shadow. The dog watched him carefully. Walter smiled. Listen to him. Ethan frowned. What? The dog. Walter scratched his beard. Animals notice things long before people do. He glanced toward the mountains, especially storms. Then he climbed into the truck and drove away, leaving Ethan alone with thoughts he couldn't easily ignore. The following morning, Ethan increased his preparations. More firewood, more water storage, additional food. He reinforced portions of the cave, improved drainage routes, expanded heat retention walls. If Walter was wrong, the extra work would cost nothing. If Walter was right, the work might save lives. Several days later, Ethan returned to Silver Creek for supplies. The town looked unchanged. People moved through daily routines. Businesses remained busy. Children played near the school. Nobody appeared concerned. At the diner, however, Ethan overheard part of a conversation. Walter Hayes sat near the front counter speaking with several ranchers. The reaction was immediate. Laughter, dismissive smiles, head shaking. One ranch owner leaned back in his chair. Every year, it's the same thing. Another chuckled. Walter sees the end of the world in every snowflake. More laughter followed. Walter simply drank his coffee, unbothered. Across the room, Harold Briggs sat near the window, listening. Eventually, he joined the conversation. Winter's coming, he shrugged. Winter always comes. Several people nodded. Harold continued. We've handled storms before. The crowd seemed reassured, comforted. Walter said nothing. Neither did Ethan. But both men exchanged a brief glance, a look that carried the same thought. This storm might be different. Outside, snow clouds gathered over the mountains. By the end of the week, temperatures dropped another 10 degrees. The valley grew quieter. Animals became harder to find. Even Shadow's behavior changed. The dog spent more time near the cave entrance, watching, listening. One evening, he suddenly growled toward the distant forest. Not aggressively, uneasily, as though sensing something beyond sight. Ethan stood beside him. The sky above the mountains had turned dark gray, heavy, oppressive. A storm front slowly spread across the horizon. For several minutes, man and dog watched in silence. Far below, Silver Creek glowed peacefully beneath the gathering darkness. The town looked safe, comfortable, unconcerned. Nobody seemed worried. Nobody seemed prepared. And that troubled Ethan more than the storm itself. Because sometimes danger wasn't what people saw coming. Sometimes danger was what they refused to believe. Behind him, the cave remained warm, stable, ready. Ahead of him, winter was gathering strength. And before long, the mountain would deliver its first test. The storm arrived 3 nights later. Not a major blizzard. Not the catastrophe Walter Hayes feared. Just a hard Wyoming snowstorm. the kind most people in Silver Creek barely noticed. But high on the mountain, Ethan Cole knew every storm mattered, especially the first one. The first storm revealed weaknesses. The first storm exposed mistakes. The first storm taught lessons. The sky darkened shortly after noon. Heavy gray clouds rolled across the Wind River Range like an advancing army. The temperature dropped rapidly. Wind swept through the pines. Snow began falling before sunset. At first it drifted gently across the mountainside. Then it thickened. Within an hour, visibility had shrunk to less than 100 yards. Ethan stood near the cave entrance watching the weather build. Shadow sat beside him. The old German shepherd seemed unusually attentive. His ears twitched constantly. His eyes never stopped scanning the darkness. Looks like Walter was right about winter, showing up early. Shadow glanced toward him briefly, then returned to watching the storm. By nightfall, snow hammered the mountains. Wind howled through the trees. The cave entrance rattled beneath powerful gusts. Inside, however, things remained surprisingly comfortable. The geothermal airflow continued working. The heat retention walls slowly released stored warmth. The sleeping chamber remained dry. For the first time since arriving, Ethan felt genuine pride. He had built something that worked. Something reliable. Something capable of surviving. He cooked a simple meal and shared part of it with Shadow. Then they settled in for the night. Outside, the storm intensified. Inside, the cave felt secure, safe, almost peaceful. That feeling lasted until shortly after midnight. Ethan woke suddenly. Something felt wrong. At first, he couldn't identify it. The cave remained dark except for the faint orange glow of dying coals. Wind still roared outside. Nothing unusual. Then he noticed the smell. Smoke, thick, sharp, wrong. His eyes opened wider. A faint haze hung in the chamber. Confusion gave way to alarm. The fire wasn't burning correctly. The smoke should have been moving away through the airflow channels. Instead, it seemed trapped, slowly spreading through the cave. Ethan sat upright immediately. The moment he moved, dizziness struck him. Not severe, but noticeable. His head felt strangely heavy, his thoughts sluggish. The realization hit him instantly. Carbon monoxide. His pulse accelerated. The smoke itself wasn't the greatest danger. The invisible gases were. The kind that quietly filled enclosed spaces. The kind that put people to sleep forever. Then he heard barking. Shadow. The German shepherd was already awake. The dog stood near the sleeping area, barking urgently. Not aggressive. Desperate. He rushed toward Ethan and grabbed the sleeve of his jacket. Pulling hard, Ethan struggled to stand. The dizziness worsened. Something had gone terribly wrong. Shadow released the jacket and sprinted deeper into the cave, then stopped, barked again. Waiting, Ethan followed. The dog led him toward the airflow corridor connecting the geothermal chamber to the main living area. Halfway there, the air grew thicker, the haze denser. Shadow barked repeatedly. Then Ethan saw it. A section of the ventilation shaft had partially collapsed. Several rocks had fallen during the storm. The opening was nearly blocked. Airflow had slowed dramatically. Smoke could no longer escape efficiently. Instead, it was backing into the living areas, poisoning the air. Ethan's military training immediately took over. Panic vanished, focus replaced it. He grabbed a pry bar, dropped to one knee, and started clearing debris. The work proved harder than expected. Several rocks had wedged tightly together. Every movement released more dust. His lungs burned. His head continued throbbing. Behind him, Shadow barked constantly, urgently. The dog refused to leave his side. Minutes passed. Then another stone shifted. A narrow gap opened. Cold air rushed through. Not enough. The blockage remained. Ethan attacked it again. This time the pry bar slipped. His knuckles smashed against the rock. Pain shot through his hand. Blood appeared instantly. He barely noticed. One more push. One more attempt. The largest stone finally broke free. It crashed onto the cave floor. A powerful current surged through the shaft. Air rushed past him. Fresh, cold, clean. The change was immediate. Smoke began moving again. The haze slowly thinned. The cave exhaled. Ethan sat back against the wall. breathing heavily, exhausted. Shadow approached and pressed against him. The dog remained there until Ethan's breathing steadied. For several minutes, neither moved. The storm continued raging outside. Inside, silence returned. Eventually, Ethan looked toward the partially cleared shaft. A sobering realization settled over him. If Shadow hadn't woken him, if Shadow hadn't insisted, if the dog had remained asleep, he might never have noticed the problem. The mountain could have quietly filled with poisonous air. The fire would have continued burning. The cave would have remained warm, and Ethan might never have woken up. The thought chilled him more than the storm. He looked down at the German shepherd. Shadow's muzzle rested against his leg, calm again, as though saving lives was simply another routine task. Maybe it was. For years, the dog had detected dangers humans couldn't. Explosives, ambushes, threats. Tonight had been no different. Only the battlefield had changed. "You saved me." Shadow lifted his head slightly. His tail thumped once against the stone floor. The simple gesture carried more meaning than words. Hours later, after the air fully cleared, Ethan sat beside the geothermal chamber, unable to sleep. The storm continued outside. Snow piled against the mountain. Wind screamed through the darkness. But Ethan barely heard it. His attention remained fixed on a different thought. The cave wasn't perfect. Not even close. For weeks he had focused on successes. The warm airflow, the hidden chamber, the engineering improvements. Tonight revealed something else. Failure, weakness, vulnerability. The cave could still kill him. A single collapsed shaft had nearly turned his greatest discovery into a tomb. The realization shook him deeply. Not because he feared hard work, because he feared false confidence. False confidence got people hurt. False confidence got people killed. He had learned that lesson long ago. Near dawn, the storm finally weakened. The wind faded. Snowfall slowed. A pale gray light began filtering into the cave. Shadow slept peacefully nearby. Ethan watched him for a long time. The old dog looked tired, older than before. The gray around his muzzle seemed more noticeable now. Time was catching both of them. Yet somehow Shadow remained exactly who he had always been. A protector, a partner, a guardian. Outside, the mountains emerged from darkness beneath a blanket of fresh snow. Beautiful, silent, deceptively peaceful. Ethan stepped outside and studied the storm's aftermath. The world looked transformed. White ridges stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Pine trees bent beneath heavy snow. Silver Creek sat far below, untouched and unaware. Most people in town would wake believing it had been an ordinary storm. For Ethan, it had been something else entirely. A warning. The mountain had revealed a flaw, and flaws demanded solutions. As he stood there, Shadow suddenly appeared beside him. The dog looked toward a distant section of the ridge, then back toward the cave, then toward the ridge again. His ears lifted, his body became alert. Ethan frowned. That look again. The same look Shadow had worn before discovering the geothermal chamber. Before finding hidden passages, before uncovering secrets, the dog had noticed something new, something hidden, and whatever it was lay somewhere deeper beneath the mountain. Shadow stood motionless near the ridge overlooking the valley. The storm had passed. Fresh snow glittered beneath the morning sun. The world looked calm again. But Ethan had learned something important during his years as a Navy SEAL. The most important discoveries often arrived immediately after danger. The German shepherd stared toward a section of rock partially exposed above the cave system. Then he looked back at Ethan, waiting the same look, the same stubborn certainty, the look that had led Ethan to the geothermal chamber, the look that had saved his life during the collapse. Ethan grabbed his lantern. "All right, partner." Shadow immediately turned and headed toward the cave. The dog moved with purpose, as though he already knew exactly where he was going. Deep inside the mountain, they passed the geothermal chamber and continued farther than ever before. The familiar sections of cave slowly gave way to narrower passages. The walls tightened, the air changed. Cooler in some places, warmer in others. Shadow remained several yards ahead. Occasionally he paused, sniffed, then continued. Eventually they reached a dead end Ethan had previously ignored. A wall of broken stone blocked the corridor. Nothing unusual. At least that's what he had thought. Shadow began digging immediately. Snow wasn't the only thing the dog excelled at uncovering. Dust and loose gravel scattered across the cave floor. The German shepherd worked with growing excitement. Ethan stepped closer, then noticed something. A faint draft, his eyebrows rose, moving air. Behind the rockfall, his pulse quickened. Not again. Not another hidden chamber. He knelt beside the pile and examined it carefully. The collapse appeared old. Very old. Some rocks were covered with mineral deposits decades in the making. This wasn't recent. Whatever lay behind it had been sealed for years, possibly generations. Ethan spent the rest of the day clearing debris. The work was exhausting. Several stones weighed more than 100 pounds. Others were wedged together so tightly they barely moved. Shadow refused to leave. Whenever Ethan paused to rest, the dog sat nearby watching the opening, waiting. By late afternoon, a narrow gap appeared. A strong current of air rushed through. Steady, cold, fresh. Ethan held the lantern near the opening. The flame bent sharply. His heart pounded. There was definitely something beyond. He widened the gap further. Finally, just before sunset, the opening became large enough to squeeze through. Ethan took a deep breath, then crawled inside. The lantern beam swept across darkness. For several seconds he simply stared. The passage extended far beyond the limits of the original cave. Not a chamber, a tunnel, a real tunnel. Straight walls, carved surfaces, tool marks. This wasn't natural. Someone had built it. Shadow slipped through behind him. The dog moved ahead immediately. His tail wagged once. The tunnel stretched deeper into the mountain. Ethan followed. The farther they traveled, the more evidence appeared. Old support beams, rusted metal brackets, fragments of rail track partially buried beneath dirt. His pulse quickened. A mine, an abandoned mine. Silver Creek had once been a mining region more than a century ago. Most operations disappeared long before Ethan arrived. Apparently, one of them had survived. Hidden beneath the mountain, forgotten. The tunnel eventually opened into a massive underground chamber. Ethan stopped in disbelief. The ceiling towered above. Multiple passages branched away into darkness. Some climbed upward. Others descended deeper underground. The airflow moved naturally through the network. Strong, stable, controlled. Suddenly, the geothermal chamber made more sense. The mountain wasn't a single cave. It was part of a much larger system. A hidden network running beneath the ridge. A network Shadow had uncovered. For nearly an hour, Ethan explored. The old mine appeared abandoned for decades, maybe longer. Yet signs of human activity remained. Broken lantern hooks, collapsed supply crates, ancient tool marks, history preserved beneath stone. Then he found something unexpected. A small room carved into one wall. Unlike the tunnels, this area seemed intentional, personal, a shelter. Inside sat a wooden table, rotting but intact. Beside it rested a rusted metal box. Ethan carefully opened the lid. Dust rose into the air. Inside lay several water-damaged notebooks. Most pages had deteriorated beyond recognition, but some remained readable. Ethan sat beside the lantern and opened the first journal. The handwriting belonged to a miner. The entries were old, very old. Winter observations, airflow notes, temperature records, sketches. His eyes widened. The miners had discovered the same thing he had: the underground heat, the ventilation system, the thermal storage properties of the stone. One entry caught his attention immediately. December 18. Outside temperature 20 below. Inside lower chamber 48 degrees. Another entry followed. The mountain stays warmer than any cabin if you understand how it breathes. Ethan stared at the words. A strange feeling settled over him. Validation. He wasn't imagining it. The mountain truly worked this way. Generations earlier, others had discovered the same secret and survived because of it. Shadow rested beside him while he continued reading. The notebooks contained practical survival knowledge. how airflow shifted during storms, which chambers remained warmest, where moisture collected, what routes stayed safe during heavy snow. The information was priceless, not treasure, not money, something better, knowledge, the kind that kept people alive. By the time Ethan returned to the main cave, darkness had fallen outside. He immediately began sketching new plans. The discovery changed everything. Additional airflow routes could be incorporated. Emergency escape paths existed. Natural heat circulation could be improved dramatically. The cave wasn't merely a shelter anymore. It was infrastructure, a survival network hidden inside the mountain. Over the next week, Ethan transformed his system. He connected airflow channels to portions of the old mine. He redirected heat through natural passages. He improved ventilation safeguards to prevent another near disaster. Every change strengthened the cave. Every improvement increased his confidence. Meanwhile, winter tightened its grip on Silver Creek. Snowstorms became more frequent. Temperatures dropped lower. Yet most townspeople remained unconcerned. At the diner, conversations focused on holiday plans. At the ranches, people trusted generators and wood stoves. Only Walter Hayes seemed uneasy. One afternoon, Ethan met the old ranger in town. Walter listened carefully as Ethan described the mine, the journals, the airflow network, the thermal chambers. When Ethan finished, Walter remained silent for several moments. Then he nodded. That mountain's been teaching people how to survive for a long time. Ethan smiled faintly. Seems so. Walter looked toward the darkening sky. Good thing you're listening. The comment lingered. Because most people weren't. Especially Harold Briggs. The wealthy ranch owner had become increasingly vocal about winter preparations. Or rather, the lack of need for them. According to Harold, Silver Creek had survived storms before. Generators were stocked. Fuel reserves were strong. Everything was under control. People wanted to believe him, so they did. But Ethan had spent enough years studying risk to recognize dangerous confidence. The mountain didn't care about confidence. The mountain cared about preparation. That evening, he stood outside the cave, watching the sun disappear behind snow-covered peaks. Shadow sat beside him. Far below, Silver Creek glowed peacefully. The town looked safe, comfortable, certain. High above them, Ethan now knew something they didn't. The mountain contained secrets older than any building in the valley. Secrets capable of preserving life through the worst winters. And if Walter's fears proved correct, those secrets might soon become very important. Because somewhere in Silver Creek, a powerful man was making a mistake built on pride. And before winter ended, that mistake would nearly cost him everything. December arrived with iron-gray skies and temperatures that rarely climbed above freezing. Snow lingered across the valley now, not enough to stop life. Just enough to remind everyone season they were entering. Silver Creek carried on as usual. School buses still rolled through town. Ranchers still repaired fences. The diner still filled every morning with coffee, gossip, and weather predictions. Most people believed they understood winter. After all, they had lived through it their entire lives. What could possibly be different this year? That question bothered Ethan more each day. Because the mountain was still giving warnings, and almost nobody seemed willing to notice. One morning, he stood near the cave entrance watching a flock of birds move south across the valley. The migration was unusually late, yet they were flying with urgency. The same urgency he had seen in the elk weeks earlier. Shadow watched them too. The dog remained unusually alert lately, often standing at the entrance for long periods, listening, watching, waiting. Walter Hayes had noticed it as well. The old ranger visited the cave again a few days later. His weathered face looked more troubled than before. The two men sat beside a small fire while Shadow rested nearby. Walter stared toward the mountains. The pressure keeps falling. Ethan nodded. I've noticed. The creek froze nearly 2 weeks early. Another pause. Walter shook his head. I don't like any of it. The wind moved through the trees outside. The cave remained warm, steady, comfortable. Yet even here, tension lingered. The mountain felt different now, as though holding its breath. Walter finally stood. "I'm heading into town." Ethan looked up. "For what?" The old ranger laughed humorlessly. One more attempt at convincing people. Ethan already knew how that would go. By noon, Walter stood inside the Silver Creek Town Hall. The monthly council meeting had drawn a large crowd. Farmers, business owners, ranchers, residents, most attended for routine issues, road maintenance, property concerns, winter budgets. Few expected the meeting to become controversial. Walter stepped forward when public comments began. His voice remained calm, measured, but the message was clear. The mountains are showing every sign of a severe winter event. Several people exchanged glances. Others rolled their eyes. Walter continued. "We need emergency fuel reserves." A few murmurs spread through the room. "We need backup shelter plans." More whispers. "We need to prepare for isolation." That was when the laughter started. Not loud, not cruel, just dismissive. The kind of laughter that comes from people who think someone is overreacting. Then Harold Briggs stood. The wealthy ranch owner looked perfectly comfortable, confident, polished, everything Walter wasn't. Harold smiled at the crowd. "Folks," his voice carried easily through the room, "we appreciate Walter's concern." Several people nodded. "But we've handled winter storms before." More agreement. Harold continued. "We have generators." A few voices called out approval. "We have fuel." More nodding. "We have snowplows." Even more agreement. The room was leaning toward him now. Walter remained silent. Harold knew it. Everyone did. Then the ranch owner delivered the line that people would remember later. The line they would repeat long after winter ended. "We don't need to start living in caves every time snow appears in the forecast." The room erupted with laughter. Even people who didn't know Ethan understood the reference. Several turned toward the back of the room, because Ethan had entered quietly moments earlier. He stood near the doorway, Shadow beside him, watching, listening. The laughter gradually faded. Harold noticed him. A slight smile crossed his face, not openly hostile, worse, amused, as though Ethan's entire life had become a joke. The room waited. Some expected an argument. Others expected anger. Instead, Ethan simply walked forward. Calmly, slowly. He stopped beside Walter, then faced the crowd. "I don't care where people shelter." Silence settled across the room. "I care whether they survive." Nobody laughed now. Ethan continued. "The mountain doesn't care how much money you have." A few faces shifted uncomfortably. "It doesn't care how long you've lived here." More silence. "It only cares whether you're prepared." The words hung in the air, simple, direct, true. Harold folded his arms. "You think we're not prepared?" Ethan met his gaze. "I think confidence isn't the same thing as preparation." The room grew quiet, very quiet. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Harold smiled again. "Well," he shrugged, "I'll take my chances in a heated ranch house." Several people laughed softly. The tension broke. The meeting moved on. And just like that, the warning disappeared beneath routine business. Road budgets, snow removal, holiday events. Life continued. Afterward, Ethan and Walter stepped outside into the cold afternoon. Snow drifted across the sidewalks. The sky looked darker than before. Walter shook his head. "They don't see it." "No, they won't." Ethan watched the clouds gathering above the mountains. "No," the old ranger sighed heavily. Then climbed into his truck. The conversation was over. The warning had been given. Nothing more could be done. Over the next week, Ethan focused entirely on preparation. His cave system continued evolving. Additional food storage, emergency water reserves, backup ventilation routes. Every lesson from the miners' journals became another improvement. Every improvement increased his chances. Shadow remained constantly involved. The dog accompanied him everywhere, inspecting tunnels, monitoring airflow, exploring the deeper mine passages. Sometimes Ethan joked that Shadow had become the mountain's assistant engineer. The dog seemed perfectly happy with the promotion. Meanwhile, Harold Briggs expanded his own confidence. The ranch owner often spoke publicly about winter readiness. He purchased a new generator, additional fuel tanks, extra equipment. To most people, he appeared responsible, prepared, in control, and that was the problem. Because true danger rarely announces itself dramatically. Sometimes danger arrives disguised as certainty. One evening, Ethan stood outside the cave watching sunset. The sky glowed orange along the horizon. The valley below looked peaceful, almost beautiful. Yet something felt wrong, very wrong. Shadow stood beside him. The German shepherd suddenly growled softly, not at anything visible. At the wind, Ethan frowned. The dog rarely reacted without reason. Then he noticed it. The silence, no birds, no animal movement, no distant sounds from the forest. The mountains had gone quiet, completely quiet. The kind of silence that appears before a storm. A real storm, not an ordinary one. Walter's warnings echoed in his mind. The elk, the frozen creek, the falling pressure, the strange migrations. Every sign pointed in the same direction. Every sign. High above Silver Creek, clouds gathered across the horizon like dark walls rising from the earth itself. Below, lights began appearing in town as evening settled over the valley. People cooked dinner, watched television, made holiday plans, laughed with family. They had no idea what was approaching, but Ethan did, and so did Shadow. The mountain had stopped whispering. It was preparing to speak, and very soon, everyone in Silver Creek would hear it. The first warning came in the form of wind, not ordinary winter wind. Something heavier, something deeper. It arrived during the night and continued into the following morning, sweeping across the mountains with a low, steady roar. Ethan stood outside the cave before sunrise. The sky was the color of steel. Clouds stretched from horizon to horizon. No breaks, no sunlight, no blue. Just an endless ceiling of gray pressing down over Wyoming. Shadow stood beside him. The German shepherd's ears remained upright, his gaze fixed on the distant ridges. Even the dog seemed uneasy. Far below, Silver Creek was beginning another ordinary day. School buses moved through town. Smoke rose from chimneys. People drove to work. Nobody appeared alarmed. Yet the mountain felt different, alive, waiting. By noon, snow began falling. Tiny flakes at first, almost harmless. They drifted lazily through the air and settled on rooftops. Children pointed at the windows. Store owners barely noticed, but Walter Hayes noticed. The old ranger parked outside the diner and stared toward the mountains. His expression darkened, because he had seen storms begin exactly this way before. Quiet, patient, deceptive. By evening, the snowfall doubled, then doubled again. Wind strengthened, visibility shrank. Road crews began treating highways. The local weather station issued warnings. Most residents shrugged. Winter storms were common here. Nobody imagined what was truly coming. High above town, Ethan made final preparations. Every container was filled with water. Every storage shelf was stocked. Every ventilation route had been inspected twice. The miners' journals lay safely protected inside a metal box. The geothermal chamber continued radiating warmth through the cave. Shadow followed Ethan from room to room. The dog sensed the tension. Animals always knew. By midnight, the storm revealed its true strength. Snow slammed against the mountain. Wind screamed through the trees. The cave entrance disappeared behind swirling white curtains. Ethan stood inside the entrance chamber, watching nature unleash itself. The mountain beyond had vanished. The valley below had vanished. The world itself seemed to be dissolving into snow. Then the power failed. Not in the cave, in Silver Creek. Far below, lights flickered across town, one by one, then disappeared. Darkness swallowed the valley. Only a few emergency generators remained visible. Ethan felt a chill unrelated to temperature. The storm was just getting started. The next morning, Silver Creek woke inside a different world. Roads were buried. Driveways vanished. Vehicles disappeared beneath drifts. Wind continued piling snow against buildings. The county snowplows struggled to keep main routes open. By afternoon, they stopped trying. The storm intensified faster than anyone expected. Snow fell sideways. Trees bent beneath its weight. Power lines snapped. Communication towers lost service. Cell phones stopped working. Internet connections vanished. Isolation spread across the valley. Meanwhile, the cave held steady. The geothermal airflow remained constant. The stone walls radiated warmth. The mine passages distributed heat exactly as Ethan had designed. The system worked better than he had dared hope. For the first time since losing his ranch, Ethan felt something close to confidence. Not arrogance, not certainty. Confidence. The difference mattered, because confidence came from preparation, not pride. Outside, however, conditions continued deteriorating. By the second day, snow reached 3 feet in some areas, then 4, then 5. The storm showed no signs of stopping. Walter Hayes remained trapped at home. Harold Briggs remained at his ranch. Families across Silver Creek rationed fuel and food. Generators ran continuously. Wood piles shrank. Anxiety grew. But still, the storm continued. The third day brought something worse: silence. Not outside. The wind still roared. The snow still fell. The silence came from the outside world. No vehicles. No radios. No contact. Nothing. Silver Creek had effectively vanished from the map. Ethan climbed to the cave entrance and stared into the blizzard. Visibility measured only a few yards. Anything beyond that disappeared into white. The storm had erased the landscape. Roads, fields, fences, everything. Gone. Shadow stood beside him. The dog suddenly growled. Low, uneasy. Then he looked toward the valley. Ethan followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing. Then he realized what Shadow had noticed. No smoke. Not from town. Not from the ranches. Not from anywhere. The storm had buried everything. The realization settled heavily inside him. People were running out of options, fast. Back inside the cave, Ethan studied maps spread across a wooden table. His military instincts were becoming impossible to ignore. This wasn't a storm anymore. It was a survival event. The kind emergency planners feared. The kind communities remembered for generations. That evening he measured snowfall near the cave entrance. 6 feet and still rising. The drifts in some places were even deeper. The mountain had become a frozen ocean. Shadow remained restless throughout the night. The German shepherd paced sections of the cave repeatedly, stopping, listening, then moving again. Ethan noticed. The behavior reminded him of deployment. Back then, Shadow often sensed trouble before humans recognized it. Hours before, sometimes days. Near midnight, Ethan woke suddenly. The dog was already standing, alert, focused, facing the entrance. The wind outside had changed. The sound was different now. Deeper, more violent. Snow hammered the mountain like waves against a ship. Ethan checked the entrance supports. Everything held. The ventilation systems remained functional. The geothermal chamber continued working. The cave was surviving. But how long could everyone else survive? The question followed him into dawn. When morning arrived, the storm finally revealed its full scale. Ethan forced open the outer barrier and stepped outside. For several seconds, he simply stared. The landscape was unrecognizable. Entire sections of forest had vanished beneath snow. Fence lines disappeared completely. Small structures were buried. Drifts towered above his head. The measuring pole near the cave entrance showed nearly 8 feet. 8 feet. Even Ethan struggled to believe it. The largest storm in decades had descended upon Silver Creek. Maybe longer. The county roads were gone. The highways were gone. The valley was trapped beneath a frozen blanket. And suddenly, Walter Hayes' warnings no longer sounded extreme. They sounded accurate. Very accurate. Ethan looked toward town. Nothing moved. No vehicles, no people, no signs of normal life. Only white. Endless white. Shadow stepped beside him. The dog stared toward the valley, then toward the distant forest, then back toward the valley again. His body stiffened. Every muscle became tense. Ethan immediately noticed. "What is it, boy?" Shadow took several steps forward, stopped, looked back, then barked once, sharp, urgent. Not a warning, a signal. The same signal he had used overseas when he found something important, something hidden, something that needed attention immediately. Ethan's pulse quickened, because after everything they had already survived together, he trusted that bark. More than forecasts, more than rumors, more than luck, Shadow had found something. Out there, somewhere beyond 8 feet of snow, And whatever it was, the dog wasn't willing to ignore it. Neither was Ethan. The wind had finally weakened, but the world remained buried. 8 feet of snow had transformed the mountains into a frozen wilderness, unlike anything Ethan Cole had ever seen. The cave behind him remained warm, safe, stable, but Shadow kept staring toward the valley. Then the dog barked again, sharp, urgent. The same signal he had used during military operations when he detected something important. Ethan trusted that bark more than he trusted luck. He grabbed his winter gear immediately. Snowshoes, rope, flashlight, emergency blanket, medical kit. The habits of a Navy SEAL never truly disappeared. Within minutes, he was ready. Shadow was already waiting at the entrance. The dog practically vibrated with determination. "All right, partner." Ethan clipped a lead to Shadow's harness. "Show me." The German Shepherd lunged forward. Together they stepped into the white wilderness. The cold hit instantly, not the ordinary cold of winter, the kind of cold that seemed alive, the kind that reached through clothing and searched for weaknesses. Snowdrifts towered above Ethan's waist, some reached his chest. Progress was painfully slow. Yet Shadow moved confidently, nose low, body focused, tracking something. The route led away from town, toward an abandoned logging road that wound through the lower forest. Visibility remained poor despite the storm's decline. Everything looked identical. Snow-covered trees, snow-covered rocks, snow-covered hills. The entire world had become white. After nearly 40 minutes of exhausting travel, Shadow suddenly stopped. His ears lifted. Then he pulled sharply to the left. Ethan followed. The dog moved toward a massive drift piled against a stand of pines. At first, Ethan saw nothing unusual. Then Shadow began digging, furiously. Snow flew in every direction. The dog's urgency sent a chill through Ethan. He dropped to his knees and started digging too. Seconds became minutes. The drift was deeper than expected. Then he heard it, a sound faint, almost impossible to detect. A weak cry, human. Ethan froze. There it was again, a desperate voice buried beneath the snow. His pulse exploded. He dug faster. Shadow dug beside him. Together they tore through the drift. Finally, Ethan uncovered a gloved hand, then an arm, then a face. A teenage girl, barely conscious. Her lips were blue, her breathing shallow. Snow had trapped her beneath a collapsed section of drift. She couldn't have survived much longer. "Stay with me." Ethan carefully cleared the remaining snow. The girl blinked weakly, confused, terrified, alive. Most importantly, alive. Shadow sat beside her immediately. The dog gently pressed against her side, providing warmth. The gesture seemed almost instinctive. Ethan wrapped the emergency blanket around her. "Can you tell me your name?" Her voice barely carried. "Sophie." Ethan recognized it immediately. Sophie Turner, a 17-year-old from Silver Creek. He had seen her working part-time at the grocery store. "What happened?" She swallowed hard. "My dad's truck got stuck 2 days ago." 2 days. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Sophie continued. "We tried walking home." Her voice trembled. "We got separated." The realization hit him. If Sophie was here, her father might still be somewhere in the storm. The thought was troubling. But right now there was only one priority: getting Sophie to safety. The return journey took nearly twice as long. The teenager could barely walk. Ethan supported most of her weight. Shadow never left her side. Whenever she stumbled, the dog immediately stopped, waited, encouraged, protected. By the time they reached the cave, darkness had fallen. The geothermal warmth greeted them like an embrace. Sophie's eyes widened. She stared at the stone walls, the warmth, the lights, the organized shelter. Disbelief spread across her face. "You live here?" Ethan nodded. "For now." She looked around again. "It feels warmer than my house." The comment lingered, because it was probably true. Ethan settled Sophie near one of the heat retention walls. Hot soup followed, dry clothes, water. Within an hour, color slowly returned to her face. The danger passed. For the first time since the rescue, Ethan relaxed. Shadow lay nearby watching her. The dog seemed satisfied. Mission accomplished, at least partially, because something still bothered Ethan, deeply. Sophie hadn't been traveling alone. That fact remained impossible to ignore. Later that evening, after she regained some strength, Ethan asked more questions. Her father had been driving home when the storm intensified. The truck became trapped. They attempted to walk the remaining distance. Visibility collapsed. The wind separated them. She never saw him again. Silence followed. The implications were obvious. Someone else was still out there, perhaps more than one person. Ethan looked toward Shadow. The dog had already lifted his head, watching, listening, almost thinking. Then Shadow stood, walked toward the cave entrance, and stared into the darkness beyond. Ethan felt a familiar sensation, the same one he experienced during deployments. The moment when a mission changed, when circumstances became larger than expected. Sophie wasn't simply a rescue. She was proof that people were trapped. Proof that people needed help. Proof that the disaster below was worse than anyone realized. The cave suddenly felt different. Not merely a shelter, a lifeboat, a refuge, a place people might desperately need. Near midnight, Sophie finally fell asleep. The first peaceful sleep she'd experienced in days. Shadow remained nearby, guarding her, just as he had guarded Ethan countless times before. Ethan sat alone beside the geothermal chamber. The miner's journals rested nearby. The warm air flowed steadily through the mountain. Outside, the blizzard-covered world remained silent. His thoughts drifted toward Silver Creek, toward the families trapped in snow, toward the elderly, the children, the ranch workers, the people who had mocked him, the people who had laughed, the people who had called him the cave soldier. A part of him remembered every insult, every look, every dismissal. But another part remembered something else, the oath he once took, the responsibility he had carried for decades. Service didn't disappear simply because life became unfair. Eventually he stood, decision made. Tomorrow he would search again and again after that, as many times as necessary. Because if Shadow could find one survivor beneath 8 feet of snow, there were probably others. The German shepherd looked back toward him. Their eyes met. No words were needed. Both already understood. The rescue of Sophie Turner was only the beginning. And before this winter was over, Shadow would become something far greater than a loyal dog. He would become the valley's only search and rescue system. The next morning began before sunrise. The storm had finally weakened, but Silver Creek remained trapped beneath a frozen prison. 8 feet of snow-covered roads, drifts swallowed fences. Entire sections of the valley had disappeared beneath white hills, sculpted by the wind. Inside the cave, Sophie Turner sat wrapped in blankets beside the heat retention wall. Her face looked healthier now. Color had returned to her cheeks. Hope had returned to her eyes, but concern remained. "My dad is still out there." The words hung heavily in the warm air. Ethan nodded. "I know." Shadow was already standing near the entrance, waiting, ready. The dog seemed to understand that today wasn't about survival anymore. It was about rescue. Within minutes, Ethan packed supplies, medical equipment, food, rope, emergency blankets, everything they might need. Before leaving, he showed Sophie how to operate the emergency lanterns, how to access stored food, how to monitor the ventilation system. The teenager listened carefully. The cave had become her lifeline. Then Ethan and Shadow stepped back into the frozen wilderness. The valley felt eerily silent. No engines, no machinery, no signs of normal life. Only wind moving softly across endless snowfields. Shadow immediately lowered his nose, searching, tracking. The dog moved with incredible focus. Years of military training seemed to awaken inside him once more. The old warrior had found his mission. Less than an hour later, Shadow stopped, then sprinted forward. Ethan followed. The dog led him toward a partially buried pickup truck, nearly invisible beneath the snow. Only part of the roof remained exposed. Ethan's pulse quickened. He rushed forward. The driver's side door was blocked. The passenger side was partially accessible. After several minutes of digging, he managed to open it. Inside sat a man wrapped in coats and blankets. Weak, exhausted, but alive. Sophie Turner's father. Relief flooded Ethan. The man looked up through tired eyes. For a moment, confusion crossed his face, then recognition. The cave guy? Ethan smiled faintly. The cave guy. Tears appeared instantly, not because of embarrassment, because of gratitude. The rescue took most of the morning. By noon, they were heading back toward the mountain. Shadow walked proudly beside them. His tail moved slightly. Mission accomplished. But once they reached the cave, something unexpected happened. Sophie threw her arms around her father. Both cried openly. The reunion filled the cave with emotion, and Ethan realized something. This storm was creating dozens of stories exactly like theirs. Families separated, people trapped, people waiting, people hoping, people scared. The thought stayed with him. By afternoon, Shadow became restless again. The dog paced near the entrance, then barked, the same urgent signal. Another one. Ethan grabbed his gear. The second rescue led them toward the northern edge of town. An elderly couple trapped inside a farmhouse. Their generator had failed. Fuel was nearly gone. The temperature inside the home had dropped dangerously low. When Ethan arrived, relief spread across their faces. The husband stared at Shadow. "How did you find us?" Ethan looked down at the dog. He heard what nobody else could. The old man nodded slowly, as though that answer somehow made perfect sense. The rescues continued, one after another, day after day. Each time Shadow found them first. A ranch worker trapped inside a collapsed equipment shed. Two brothers stranded in a hunting cabin. A widow isolated by drifts taller than her house. A family whose chimney had become completely blocked by snow. Again and again, the German Shepherd located people no one else could reach. Word slowly spread. Not through phones, not through television. Through survivors, stories, whispers, hope. People began speaking about Ethan Cole and his dog with a kind of awe. The same people who once laughed now spoke differently. The cave soldier, the mountain dog, the rescuers. 3 days after Sophie's rescue, Shadow detected something else. Something farther away. Something important. The trail led directly toward Briggs Ranch. Ethan's stomach tightened. Harold Briggs, the man who had mocked him most openly. The man who had blocked the trailer rental. The man who laughed during the town meeting. The man who believed confidence could defeat winter. The ranch house eventually emerged through the snow. The sight stopped Ethan cold. The generator was silent. No smoke rose from the chimney. The windows were dark. Shadow immediately rushed forward. Ethan followed. The front door was nearly buried. It took 15 exhausting minutes to reach it. When he finally forced it open, cold air poured out. The interior felt barely warmer than outside. Harold Briggs sat near a dead fireplace, wrapped in blankets, exhausted. His wife sat beside him. 2 ranch hands occupied the corner. All of them looked defeated. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Harold simply stared. Disbelief spread across his face, because standing in the doorway was the last person he expected to see. Ethan Cole, the homeless veteran, the caveman, the man he had ridiculed. The silence felt endless. Finally, Harold spoke. His voice sounded weak. "We ran out of fuel yesterday. No excuses, no pride, just truth." Ethan nodded. "Can you travel?" Harold looked around the frozen room, then toward his wife, then back toward Ethan. The answer was obvious. They had no choice. Hours later, the difficult journey began. The snow remained deep. The wind remained cold. Yet slowly, steadily, the group climbed toward the mountain, toward the cave, toward the place everyone once mocked. By sunset, they reached the entrance. Harold stopped the moment warm air touched his face. The cave glowed with lantern light. Heat radiated from the stone walls. People moved about safely. Children slept. Meals cooked. Life continued. The contrast felt unbelievable. Outside existed disaster. Inside existed refuge. Harold stepped into the cave and looked around. His eyes widened. The geothermal chamber, the heat retention walls, the ventilation systems, the underground shelter. Everything he once dismissed, everything he once laughed at, everything he once considered foolish, had saved dozens of lives. No one spoke. No one needed to. The truth filled the room. Later that evening, survivors gathered around the central chamber. The atmosphere felt different now. quiet, reflective. Many of them had spent months judging Ethan. Some had mocked him. Others ignored him. Now they sat inside the shelter he built, alive because of it, alive because of Shadow, alive because one man chose preparation over pride. Harold sat alone near one of the stone walls, watching the warmth radiate from the mountain itself. Eventually, he looked toward Ethan. The ranch owner seemed smaller somehow, not physically, emotionally. The storm had stripped something away: pride, certainty, arrogance. What remained was simple honesty. "You warned us." Ethan remained silent. Harold lowered his gaze, and I laughed. The cave grew quiet. No one interrupted. No one looked away. Then Harold glanced toward Shadow, sleeping beside the firelight. If that dog hadn't found people, his voice trailed off. The rest didn't need saying. Everyone already understood. The cave that had become a joke was now the heart of Silver Creek. And as the survivors sat together beneath the mountain, surrounded by warmth and silence, they finally recognized something they should have understood from the beginning. The strongest people weren't always the loudest. The wisest ideas weren't always the most popular. And sometimes the man everyone overlooks becomes the one who saves them all. The storm finally released its grip 12 days later, not all at once. Slowly, reluctantly, the winds weakened first. Then the snowfall stopped. Finally, pale sunlight returned to the valley. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the people sheltering inside Ethan Cole's cave stepped outside and saw the world clearly. The sight left many speechless. Silver Creek looked as though winter had tried to erase it. Snowdrifts towered over rooftops. Collapsed sheds dotted the landscape. Roads remained invisible beneath frozen hills. Entire sections of fencing had vanished. The valley would need months to recover, yet people were alive. That fact mattered more than anything else. Inside the cave, life had settled into an unexpected rhythm during the crisis. Families shared meals. Children played near the warm stone walls. Neighbors, who barely knew one another before the storm, now worked together naturally. The cave had become something greater than shelter. It had become a community, a place where survival and kindness existed side by side. And at the center of it all rested Shadow. The aging German shepherd spent most of his time sleeping now. The rescue missions had taken their toll. Gray fur covered much of his muzzle. His movements had become slower, but whenever someone approached to thank him, the old dog would gently wag his tail. The valley had fallen in love with him, especially the children. They followed him everywhere. Harold Briggs noticed it too. One morning, he stood near the geothermal chamber, watching several kids sit beside Shadow. The ranch owner shook his head softly. That dog changed everything. Ethan glanced toward his partner. No, Harold looked confused. Ethan smiled faintly. He reminded people what mattered. The answer stayed with Harold long after the conversation ended. As roads slowly reopened, rescue crews finally reached Silver Creek. State workers, emergency responders, utility teams. They arrived expecting tragedy. Instead, they found something remarkable. The town had survived, not because of government aid, not because of expensive equipment, not because of luck, because a homeless veteran and his retired military dog had prepared when nobody else did. The story spread quickly, first across neighboring counties, then throughout Wyoming. Reporters arrived. Photographers followed. Everyone wanted to see the cave. Everyone wanted to meet the dog. Ethan hated the attention. Shadow tolerated it. Barely. The dog usually responded by walking away and finding a quiet place to nap. One afternoon, nearly a month after the storm ended, a team of engineers arrived to inspect the underground system. Their curiosity focused on the geothermal airflow network, the mine passages, the thermal efficiency, the hidden chambers. Several experts spent days exploring the mountain. Then something unexpected happened. Shadow found another secret. The discovery began on a quiet spring morning. Snowmelt trickled down the mountain. The valley below slowly returned to life. Ethan was repairing a section of ventilation support when Shadow disappeared into one of the deeper mine passages. At first, he didn't think much of it. The dog often wandered, especially inside familiar territory. But nearly 20 minutes passed, then 30. Finally, Ethan heard barking. Not alarmed barking, excited barking. The kind Shadow used when he found something unusual. Ethan grabbed a lantern and followed. Deep inside the mine network, beyond several chambers rarely visited, he found the dog standing beside a collapsed stone wall. Fresh debris covered the floor. Apparently, spring thaw had loosened part of the structure. A narrow opening now existed where none had before. Shadow barked again, then squeezed through. Ethan followed. The hidden chamber beyond was unlike anything he had seen. Smaller than the geothermal rooms, drier, more organized, almost deliberate. Near one wall sat a rusted metal trunk, protected from moisture by an overhanging shelf of stone. Ethan carefully opened it. Inside lay notebooks, maps, letters, dozens of them. Unlike the miners' journals, these documents remained remarkably well preserved. He opened the first notebook. The handwriting appeared military, precise, disciplined, professional. His pulse quickened. The entries dated back to the 1940s, World War II era. The author identified himself as Captain James Whitaker, a military mountain survival instructor. For several minutes, Ethan read silently. Then disbelief spread across his face. The notebooks described winter survival techniques, airflow systems, heat retention strategies, underground shelter construction. Many of the principles mirrored the solutions Ethan had independently developed inside the cave. Page after page revealed observations about the mountain, its geothermal features, its airflow patterns, its ability to protect life during extreme winters. The similarities felt almost impossible. It was as though two men separated by 80 years had arrived at the same conclusions, using different lives, different experiences, different generations. The discovery affected Ethan more deeply than he expected. For months he had wondered whether he was simply improvising, guessing, hoping. Now he knew something else. The mountain worked because the principles were real. The evidence had been sitting beneath the stone all along. When news of the discovery spread, excitement swept through Silver Creek. The cave gained a new reputation, not merely as a storm shelter, not merely as a rescue center, but as part of local history, a living piece of Wyoming's past. The greatest surprise came several weeks later during a town gathering. Residents filled the community center. Families, ranchers, teachers, business owners. People Ethan once believed would never accept him. Harold Briggs stood at the front. His expression carried none of the confidence that once defined him, only sincerity. The room gradually quieted. Harold cleared his throat. There are times in life when a person learns he was wrong. The crowd listened carefully. I was wrong about Ethan Cole. Silence followed. Harold continued. I was wrong about that cave. His voice tightened slightly. And I was definitely wrong about that dog. Laughter spread through the room. Warm laughter. Affectionate laughter. Not cruel. Harold looked toward Ethan, then toward Shadow. If they hadn't been there, many of us wouldn't be here either. Nobody argued. Nobody disagreed, because everyone knew it was true. Then Harold revealed the town council's decision. A decision reached unanimously. The mountain overlooking Silver Creek would receive a new name. The room erupted into applause before he even finished speaking. Shadow Ridge, named after the dog who had saved countless lives. The applause continued for nearly a full minute. Children cheered. Adults stood. Some wiped away tears. Shadow himself remained completely unimpressed. The old German shepherd simply yawned and rested his head on Ethan's boot. The reaction only made people love him more. Months passed. Spring became summer. Summer drifted toward autumn. Life slowly returned to normal. But not the old normal. Something had changed. Silver Creek remembered. The community remembered. And Ethan remembered too. One evening, nearly a year after the storm, he sat outside the cave, watching sunset paint the valley gold. The rebuilt town stretched peacefully below. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children played near newly repaired homes. The scars of winter had mostly healed. Shadow rested beside him, older now, slower now, but still watching, still listening. still faithful. For a long time, neither moved. The silence felt comfortable, healing. Ethan thought about Rachel. The grief remained. Perhaps it always would, but something else had changed. For years he had carried guilt like a stone, believing he failed her, believing he failed others, believing loss defined him. The mountain had taught him something different. Life wasn't measured only by what you couldn't save. It was also measured by what you could. The people inside the cave, the families reunited, the lives protected, the future created afterward. Those things mattered too. Eventually he looked down at Shadow. The dog opened one eye, then slowly thumped his tail against the ground. Ethan smiled. The valley below glowed warmly in the fading light. For the first time in many years, he no longer felt like a man hiding from his past. He felt like a man who had finally found his place. Below him stood a community. Beside him rested a loyal friend. Above him stretched the mountain that had given him a second chance. And somewhere in the quiet Wyoming evening, the wind moved gently through the ridge, now carrying the name of a dog who refused to give up on people. Shadow Ridge, a place born from survival, strengthened by loyalty, and remembered because one homeless Navy SEAL and one extraordinary dog chose compassion when the world gave them every reason not to. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan Cole wasn't simply surviving. He was home. If Shadow had been your dog, comment 1 below. If you believe loyalty like that is one of the greatest gifts in life, comment 0. Sometimes the people who get judged the hardest end up showing the most courage when it matters most. And if you enjoy stories about justice, resilience, and ordinary Americans standing strong through hard times, subscribe and join us for the next unforgettable story.